One of my summer college jobs I had, and this would have been in 1978, was at a place that made shade screens predominantly for cars. This was before window tinting films were around, or at least if they were very expensive. And these screens were either silver, or they had a desert scene on them, or whatever kind of scene. They had the little holes in them. You probably seen them at some point maybe, and they allowed some sunlight to go through, and they blocked a lot of the hot desert sunlight from coming in. I worked at a place that made and installed those in cars and homes, and one of the employees there that I befriended was an audio guy, and we talked about audio gear. I was just kind of getting into stereos at that point in time, and one day he invited me to come over to his house. Actually, he lived with his parents. He was a few years older than me, so I'm guessing he was probably, I don't know, we'll say 23. And he had me come over and check out his stereo system. And I'm pretty sure he had big Sur and Vega speakers. I have no idea what he had for receiver and all that. But one thing I will never forget was the dbx 3BX was part of the system. And the lights going on and all that just kind of impressed me, and I never forgot it. Fast forward many, many years until the present, and my good buddy Ian had one that he wants me to check out, or I asked if I could check it out actually, and that is what this video will focus on, is the dbx 3BX. In 1981, the dbx 3BX would have cost $699, or about $2,420 in today's money. There was also a separate wired remote which rang in at $149, or about $540 today. The purpose of the dbx 3BX was to expand the music that you listen to. You have to remember back then it was predominantly tape decks and records, and the dynamic range was often limited on those. And so the dbx, it basically expands the louder sounds to make them a little bit louder, and it quiets the softer sounds, and so it increases the dynamic range between your lowest sounds and your highest sounds. And it also has functions if you wanted to use it for recording, but you probably wanted to have the dbx noise reduction system, which was an outboard accessory, or some cassette decks had that ability to do the dbx recording. So as far as what we're going to test in this video is kind of how it affects your signal as far as frequency response and THD, that kind of thing. And then I'll show you what it looks like when I actually process some music before the dbx was applied and after it was applied, and you can kind of see that little plot of that. So we're going to get into a little tour of the front and the back, and then I'll take the top off. You can see kind of what it looks like on the inside, and then of course there will be data, and then I'll tell you what I learned from listening and using the dbx 3BX. Here's a close-up view of the dbx 3BX, and starting on the right, these 4 push buttons here are mainly used for when you would have a tape deck hooked up. For my testing, I use the source pressed in as well as the post push button pressed in. Here's our transition level control. When it's fully to the left, there's 0 dB gain, and when it's fully to the right, there is the maximum amount of gain. These 3 rows of yellow, orange LEDs, and red LEDs show how much of a gain change the expansion is affecting things, and when it's making softer sounds softer, then the yellow LEDs come on, and when it's making louder sounds a little bit louder, the red LEDs will come on. This right here is our expansion control as it's labeled, and it goes from 1.0 to 1, or 0% expansion, all the way over to 1.5 to 1, or 50% expansion. Here is our remote switch, and if we had a remote hooked up in the back, you would be able to depress this button, the yellow LED would come on, and you would be able to remotely control the functions on the 3BX. If the remote is not plugged in and you depress this, it would bypass the functionality of the 3BX. And this is our power on-off button, and when it's on, the LED comes on. This obviously is the rear of the 3BX, and over here is our remote connector. So if we had the remote control, we would plug it in there. These are the outputs that I used, and these would be the input connections that I used. These are the outputs if you're using a tape deck, and these are the inputs if you are using the tape recorder. Here is a view looking from the top of the 3BX dbx with the cover removed. You can see the power supply transformer here and kind of just what's going on. There's a lot of adjustments that could be made. Now, I did not have the service manual to be able to make any adjustments, so it was tested as it was. And here is another view. You can kind of just see the 3 LED boards here. This would be the expansion level slider pot, and this would be the transition level slider pot. These capacitors for the power supply have all been replaced with newer, I think they're Panasonic low ESR caps. Right now we're looking at our standard THD SNR plot at 1 kHz with a 1 volt RMS or 0 dBV signal applied to the 3BX, and the 3BX is in the bypass position. In order to do that, as long as you don't have a remote plugged in the back, you press the remote push button in all the way and the LED comes on and it bypasses the circuitry of the 3BX pretty much. You can see that it still has some effect here. We're getting some effect of the power supply here, but the SNRs are above 86 dB and the THD is way low, and you can see it does add a bit of loss between half a dB to a dB, we'll call it, just going through probably the switches of the 3BX. Right now we're looking at our standard THD SNR plot at 1 kHz with a 0 dBV signal going into the 3BX. I have the expansion control set for 0% expansion, and I have the transition level control set to the full left position, which is no gain. And you can see right now we do have 0 dB of gain. Our SNRs are 77 to 73 dB. THD is not more than 0.04%. I've now moved the expansion control to the 1.25 setting or 25% expansion. You can see our SNRs are about the same. However, our gain dropped from about 0 dB of gain to, we'll just say 2.6 dB of loss. And you can see that our THD is possibly a little bit better at 0.03%, we'll call it. Now, the specification is the THD should be not more than 0.1% from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, regardless of the expansion setting. I've now moved the expansion control to 1 or 50% expansion, and you can see that our gain has dropped. We're at about, we'll call it 6.5 dB of loss through it. SNRs really didn't change. The THD went up just a little bit. We'll call it 0.05%, but it's still meeting the specification. I'm going to move the expansion level down to 1.25 or 25% expansion, and I'm going to play with the transition level control. Right now it's full to the left. I'm going to move it about halfway, and we'll see what happens, notably to the gain. So the transition level control is in the halfway position, or about 50%. And it looks like our gain went up about 2.5 dB. I'm going to move it all the way to the right. The transition control is fully to the right. You can see our SNRs improved just a little bit. The gain went up to, 7.7 dB of gain, and our THD went up a little bit. It's still better than 0.08%, we'll call it, so it's still meeting specification. Right now we're looking at the 3BX's frequency response from 20 Hz to 20 kHz with a 0 dBV signal applied. The expansion control is set to 1, so there is no expansion going on, and the transition level control is set to the full left position, so there would be no gain. The specification states that with an expansion of 1.0 from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, the frequency response should be plus or minus half a dB, so we are meeting that requirement. Let's see what happens when we move the expansion control to 1.25. Things get a little worse when the expansion control is at 1.25. It's still meeting the plus or minus half a dB requirement, pretty much, maybe off a little bit here on the right channel. But overall, I would say that it's doing okay. And if we max the expansion to 50% or 1.5, let's see what happens. So with the expansion control set to 1.5, you can see that our frequency response is not great, especially here at the high end above 10 kilohertz. We're a bit over a dB depending on the right channel. Left channel is just under a dB, and maybe down here we're about 0.8 of a dB for the right channel. So this is what the frequency response looks like for this particular 3BX with a expansion of 50%. So once again, we're looking at the frequency response from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz with a 1 volt RMS signal applied to the 3BX. The expansion is set for 1.0 or no expansion, and the transition level is fully to the left. I'm going to go ahead and increase the transition level fully to the right, which would give us the most gain. So with 0 expansion and the transition level control fully to the right, there really is no effect. Now I've got the transition control all the way to the left, and I'm going to go ahead and set the expansion to 10%. You can see it's changed it a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and hit the transition to about the 3rd position from the left. So now I've adjusted the transition level so it's about the 3rd position from the left, and you can see how it's affecting the frequency response. It's kind of increasing the gain at part of the band and maybe attenuating a little bit there around 3 kilohertz. But that is the effect that you're seeing. And so now let's see what happens if I set the expansion up to 1.2 or 20%. And you can see the frequency response gets worse. And I'm going to increase the transition level one more notch to the right. And you can see that the frequency response gets even worse. And if I go full to the right with the transition level control, we have over 7 dB of gain at the high end of the band. So you'd probably want to be a little careful with the transition control. It does have LEDs that are supposed to help you in adjusting the settings, but for the testing I'm doing, the LEDs aren't really much use. But that kind of just shows how the transition and expansion controls affect the frequency response. Right now I've got the inputs to the 3BX terminated into shorts, and we're looking at the system noise level from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz with a weighting applied, because there is a specification that says with a 0 dBV signal we should be 90 dB below that, and indeed we're about 100 dB below that. So it is meeting its noise level requirement. I should point out that the expansion is set for 1.2 or 20%, and the transition level is set for 2 for this particular measurement. This plot shows the THD versus frequency for several different input signal levels going into the 3BX. Our frequency range is 25 hertz to 20 kilohertz. There was a big rise in the THD at 20 hertz, so I'm just showing it from 25 hertz on up. And the specification was that for an expansion of 0, it's basically not doing any expansion. It should be less than 0.1% across the band, and indeed it is. I'm going to go ahead and increase the expansion to about 1.2 or 20% and see what the THD versus frequency looks like then. Once again, we have the 3BX's THD versus frequency and input signal level from 25 hertz to 20 kilohertz. In this case, the expansion is set to 1.2 or 20%, and the transition level is set to the 2nd mark from the left. The specification is that it should be better than 0.1%, and 0.1% would be everything below this line, and it's a little bit above 0.1% for the 0 dBV case, but for the most part, it is meeting its specification. This plot shows the 3BX's crosstalk from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz with a 0 dBV signal applied. There is no specification for crosstalk, but it actually looks pretty good. It's better than 50 dB worst case for the right to left crosstalk, and it's much better for the left to right crosstalk for some reason. But anyway, this kind of just shows it for reference. In case anybody was wondering what the multitone response looked like, now there were no multitone response specifications back when this guy was new. It doesn't look very good at the low end of the band. It's about 8 bits of distortion-free range, and once we get to about a kilohertz, it's about 13 bits of distortion-free range. Right now, I have got a 6 dBV or 2 volt RMS signal applied to the input of the 3BX. I have the expansion set for 1.2 or 20%, and the transition level is set at 2. And you can see our THD is still meeting the requirement. We are better than 0.07%. SNR is right around 80 dB, and our gain is about 0.3 of a dB or so. So it's looking pretty good. It's interesting to note that the 60 hertz hum for the left channel is way down in the mud, and the right channel's up here about maybe not minus 90 dB or so. And you can also see kind of the harmonics are a bit different between the left and right channel. For whatever reason, the right channel is worse, and that's why its SNR is worse here. I wanted to demonstrate how you would use the 3BX, and I do have the expansion set for 1.3 or 30% expansion. And I'm going to start off with the transition level fully to the left, which would be 0 dB gain. And let's turn on some music. So what you want to do is bring the transition level up until you start getting the red LEDs coming on as you have a louder passage in the music. And then when it gets quieter, the yellows come on. So it's kind of in a good spot right now. You can kind of just see the LEDs move, and it's it's monitoring the 3 different bands. And that's kind of how it's set. If I were to crank this up, it would probably get a little bit louder, but it's not going to come through with the camera microphone. But that's just kind of how you would adjust the transition level to get the right settings for the 3BX. I wanted to see if I could measure the difference between 2 pieces of recorded music, one using the dbx 3BX and the other bypassing the 3BX. In order to do that, I hooked up a turntable to my Yamaha RX 2090 receiver, and I hooked up the dbx to the tape monitor output, or I bypassed the tape monitor output and did a direct recording using an A to D converter, and I copied both tracks as WAV files at CD quality. What we are seeing over here on this right bunch of data is the direct recording, so we're bypassing the dbx 3BX, and on the left, this guy over here, this is a recording made going through the dbx 3BX. This software is called Music Scope. You might be able to find it for free on the internet if you look hard enough, and it does a pretty good job of identifying what kind of a WAV file is, and you can see kind of just the basic information about the recording. So both were recorded using the same LP, and I use Audacity software and my Behringer A to D converter to make WAV files. And then the song that I used was the B-52's Party Out of Bounds. It kind of shows a lot of information, but the big takeaway is that there is not a lot of difference going on whether I ran the sound through the dbx 3BX or I just bypassed it. This right here, this graph right here, this shows you the intensity at each frequency over the entire track, and it compares pretty well. So this is the side that had the 3BX, and there's a little difference going on here, but overall it's maybe just a tad higher a little bit at the high end, but for the most part there's not a lot of difference in the frequency. So here is 22.05 kilohertz, and it just shows you that at some point during the track there was a maximum, let's say at 5.51 kilohertz, this was the maximum value, and likewise over here. So it kind of just gives you the max value of the signal at that point in time, at that frequency. And this guy right here is the stereo image, I guess you would call it, and they're both pretty much the same. This guy right here shows peaks and nulls of the sound, and they both pretty much look the same. The big thing that measures dynamic range are two things, and that is the crest factors, and those are both 11.1. That shows kind of the amount of compression, and then this LRA number right here. The higher the LRA number, the more dynamic the music is. So the one with the dbx is what, 5.5 versus 5.3, so it's just a tad bit higher. But for the most part, there's not a lot of major difference between the two recordings. And like I said, these were both made using the same record and then using a A to D converter. It doesn't show a lot of difference, maybe a little bit more at the high end. It's just slightly higher, but not a lot higher here at the high end of the frequency band. But overall, there wasn't really much of an effect of using the dbx 3BX. Now, it was set for about 1.3 to 1 or 30% expansion, and the transition level was adjusted to give about the proper amount of LED movement between the red and orange LEDs. There were really only 3 specifications provided by dbx on the 3BX, and those were for the noise level, the THD, and for the frequency response, and that kind of depended on the expansion control being set 1.0 to 1 or no expansion, and it basically met those requirements. Now, as you also saw from the data, is as you increase the transition level control more to the right and increase it, your gain went up. It also changed the frequency response more so at the high end. It got really high as far as the amount of dB. I think at one point with maximum transition level and a expansion of, I don't know, was it 1.25 to 1? It had over 8 dB of gain at 20 kilohertz. So it does affect your sound quality as far as the frequency response. Now, as far as the distortion, it seemed to not be as affected as much by the distortion, and the noise level without a lot of expansion or transition level was okay. So overall, it kind of was a surprise to me at how much the frequency response changed. Now, as far as how it affects the music, I hooked it up to my Carver M400A cube amplifier along with the Carver C1 preamplifier. I had this in the external processor loop for the C1, so I could switch it in and out real easily, and the amplifier was hooked up to the Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2 speakers. My music source was my Surfans music player, which is basically playing CD quality WAV files. And after listening to it for quite a while, and I did most of the listening with it set for about 1.25 to 1 for the expansion, and the transition level control was adjusted so that it was, you know, the yellow LEDs and the red LEDs were kind of going back and forth there like I showed you earlier. And it didn't really affect the music one bit. And I got to thinking a bit, well, today our dynamic range on CDs is really, really good. It's much better than what people were dealing with in the late 70s and 80s with albums and cassettes. So I really couldn't hear any difference for the most part switching the dbx 3BX in and out. If I increased the transition level so I got the most gain, it got a little bit louder, but when you would set it for the way you would normally use it, there really was no difference in the sound whatsoever. And like I said, that makes sense because the sources we are using today have pretty good dynamic range. So I got out the turntable and I hooked the turntable up to the Carver C1 and listened to a record, and the only time I heard any kind of difference from the dbx 3BX was on the soft passages of the music where it wasn't so loud. And I listened to several different tracks. I think it was Billy Joel's Piano Man LP. And it didn't make a lot of difference. I was really surprised that the high end, where you saw that big boost in frequency response, of course it's up probably above 15K, where my hearing and most people's hearing isn't as effective. I didn't really hear any effect of that really high-end frequency response boost that the testing showed. So really, it's a nice thing to watch. You know, I like the lights. There's still something about the lights moving, you know, back and forth and all that, but it really didn't affect the music one way or the other. So that's kind of my take on the 3BX dbx. Maybe in some people's systems it might have more of an effect depending on you know, the music that they're listening to. Maybe some old records, it might sound better, but from my use with records or with the little Surfans player playing CD quality music, it really didn't make much difference. So I was really kind of disappointed. Something that I had always, you know, had such high regards for, and I actually owned one of these, a different version of this, for a while till it broke. And I did not have my YouTube channel at the time where I was testing stuff, so I never really did anything other than move the controls around and watch the lights go. So, you know, it kind of serves a purpose in that way. But as far as changing the quality of music for most people today, I don't think it's, you know, something that is of much value. But it is, you know, kind of like an antique. It's kind of a cool piece of gear, I think, just as far as the way it looks, and, you know, lights moving back and forth. So under the right circumstances, I suppose it would be fun to have in your system. So that's kind of my take on the dbx 3BX. If you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. If you have questions or comments about the video, please leave them in the appropriate area. And if you have not subscribed to the channel, please do so. So until next time, have a great day or night.